They saw a black man walk into the city's most powerful private bank wearing a hoodie and old sneakers. They saw the scuffed backpack, the tired eyes, the quiet manner. They saw everything they thought they needed to see. What they didn't see. A man who owned controlling shares in the very institution whose doors he'd just walked through. What started as laughter and whispered mockery would end in stunned silence and the closing of an entire branch. And it all began on a rainy Monday morning when he decided to open a trust for the woman who raised him from nothing. They didn't see a client walk in. They saw a man they thought didn't belong. On an afternoon that shimmered with Los Angeles heat, the heavy glass doors of an ultra-exclusive private bank swung open. A man stepped through, dark-skinned, bearded, dressed in a plain polo shirt and scuffed shoes. He moved with quiet certainty, clutching a worn leather folder to his chest. Inside, the marble lobby felt colder than ice. Crystal chandeliers threw sharp reflections on polished floors. Every gesture here was choreographed for the wealthy, hushed tones. Silk ties, polite nods to the staff behind the reception. He wasn't wealth, he was a disruption, an unexpected variable in a world built to keep people like him out. But what they didn't know was that behind those ordinary clothes lay an empire, and today, that empire had business here. Business driven by something deeper than pride, love for his dying mother. At first, they thought he was lost. Then they realized he wasn't leaving. He stepped up to the marble reception desk. The receptionist wore a crisp black suit, practiced a bright corporate smile that had greeted hedge fund titans and real estate magnates alike. But her smile faltered. The moment he spoke softly, almost gently. I'm here to open a family trust, a private account. My mother is ill. I need it processed today. For a heartbeat, the lobby seemed to still. The receptionist's eyes darted to the scuffed shoes, the worn folder, the plain polo shirt, no designer logos, no gold watch. She cleared her throat, the professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the thought behind her eyes. What is someone like you doing here? She forced the smile back. Sir, do you have an appointment? He did, but the tone of her question cut deeper than words. It wasn't curiosity. It was challenge, as if asking, are you sure you belong here? Around them, polished shoes shuffled. Bank employees paused, glancing over the top of monitors, trading silent looks that spoke volumes. He nodded, handing over his ID. Yes, 2 p.m. with your senior account manager. The receptionist took the ID, scanning it, fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. Her professional mask slipped just a bit more. She read the name for the first time. Uncertainty flickered in her eyes. But habit and bias are powerful things. She gestured for him to wait. And as he stepped aside, whispers began to rise behind the marble counters. It only took seconds for quiet judgment to become open scorn. As he stood by the glass wall, the lobby seemed to shrink around him. Every whisper felt louder, every sideways glance sharper. Behind the counter, 2 junior associates leaned close, voices low but not low enough. One tilted his head, mocking disbelief painted across his face. Did you see what he's wearing? The other snorted, shaking her head, probably delivering something. No way, he's a client. Further down, an older manager adjusted his tie, trying to appear professional, yet his eyes held the same calculation. They measured the scuffed sneakers, the weathered backpack. They saw what they expected to see, someone who didn't belong. In luxury banking, perception is everything. Appearance is silent currency. They weighed him not by balance sheets or portfolio size, but by cloth and leather and shine. One whispered to another, just tell him the minimum is too high. He'll leave. He heard them. He heard every word, but he didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't look embarrassed. He stood there calmly, like a man used to waiting, used to being underestimated, and quietly keeping score. In that polished lobby of marble floors and gold-lettered directories, a quiet tension settled, the tension of a story building toward something none of them saw coming. As he approached the service desk, the senior associate tried to keep her tone neutral, professional, yet distant, the way people do when they think they're dealing with someone who won't matter in 5 minutes. She asked, almost dismissively. Name, sir? He answered softly. Precise. For a moment, the name meant nothing. Then her fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. The screen flickered, pulling up a digital file. Something in the system recognized that name, a connection, a flagged note, a private wealth tag. She swallowed hard, brows knitted together in a room designed to stay silent. Tension makes its own noise. It hums in the marble, crackles through the glass, tightens the throat. Her voice dropped, suddenly careful. I see you're here to discuss a trust. Other staff peeked over monitors. One stepped closer to see what flashed across her screen. It wasn't the look of a courier. It wasn't the profile of an unknown. The system showed affiliations, holdings, corporate umbrellas, connections to investment funds they'd only heard about in hushed strategy meetings. In seconds, the man they thought they could brush aside had become someone they should never have doubted. But still, they couldn't fully process it, because prejudice doesn't die at the sight of a name. It only wavers, uneasy, waiting to see if it must step aside, or if it can keep its grip. Sometimes the most disarming power move is a simple question. The senior associate cleared her throat. fighting the instinct to double-check what she saw on the screen. Clients like him didn't usually walk in quietly. They sent teams, lawyers, family office reps. But this man, alone.com, not asking for favors, just stating intent. He leaned in slightly, eyes level with hers, voice as steady as a heartbeat in a quiet room. Before we proceed, could you explain your private trust structure? The words were polite, almost routine, but the tone carried something they hadn't expected: authority. That question wasn't from a curious outsider. It came from someone who knew what it came in. Trust looked like who understood how liquidity windows worked, who could read balance sheets as easily as they could read subway signs. Behind the front desk, two junior clerks shot each other a glance. They'd rehearsed answers for ultra-high clients, but not for someone who looked like him, who dressed down, who walked in alone. The senior associate opened her mouth, words faltering just a second too long, long enough to betray surprise, long enough for the man to catch it. He didn't smirk, didn't lean back in triumph, just waited. Because real power isn't loud, it's patient, and knows it can afford to wait while the room catches up. Some truths don't arrive all at once. They dawn like sunrise on a skyline. The woman's explanation started steady. Technical terms flowed: irrevocable trust, grantor powers, discretionary distribution, cross-border compliance. She'd given this pitch 100 times, but as she spoke, something shifted. She noticed how his eyes never drifted, never blinked away following every term, nodding slightly when she used correct tax language, not a bored nod, but the nod of someone who'd read these contracts before. Then came the moment that cracked the glass. We recommend a layered trustee structure with an SPV in Luxembourg. Before she finished, he added quietly, to minimize FATCA exposure and shield direct liability. Smart. She paused, just for a breath, but the junior clerks caught it. Their manager had been corrected, or rather, completed by the very man they'd quietly written off. They glanced again at his worn leather briefcase, his clean but simple coat. They'd missed something badly. And that's the thing about bias. It doesn't shout its arrival, it whispers, until truth answers back. Louder. Outside. The afternoon sun spilled across marble floors. Inside. The realization was still spreading. This was no hopeful walk-in. This was a man with a plan. A man who'd done his homework. A man who could run circles around them if he wanted. And for the first time since he'd entered the room, leaned forward, not to judge, but to listen. Sometimes power doesn't need to be announced. It just sits there, quietly, undeniable. The senior manager cleared her throat. Flipping through the forms, buying time, he waited, unbothered, thumb resting lightly on his phone. No tapping, no scrolling, just stillness. They offered to email him the paperwork. Instead, he produced his own draft trust agreement. 27 pages, flagged with notes and citations. It wasn't printed at home. The letterhead alone, discreet and embossed, spoke volumes. An elite legal firm known for billion-dollar clients. He'd walked in looking like any other man, but his preparation spoke of someone who didn't ask if something could be done, only how fast. Then came the card, simple, black, weighty in the hand, not the bright gold or platinum the clerks fawned over. This card absorbed light rather than reflected it, an symbol that banks didn't advertise. When he placed it on the marble desk, no words followed, no smirk, no boast. Just an unspoken message. Run the credit check. You'll see. The air changed. Respect didn't arrive instantly. It leaked in, one cautious drop after another. The clerk stepped back. The manager leaned forward, suddenly attentive. Years of whispered prejudice crashing into a single, silent flex. And still, he didn't brag, didn't remind them what the card meant. Because real wealth, real power, doesn't need commentary. He had walked in asking about a trust, but now they saw. He could buy the trust department if he chose. Behind every move of power lies a reason the world can't see at first glance. They only saw a man trying to open a trust, but they didn't see the sleepless nights, the quiet hospital visits, the trembling hand of an aging mother, who once held his whole world together. This wasn't about flexing on a bank. It wasn't about putting people in their place. It was about building a shield, something that could hold her medical care, her home, her dignity, no matter what happened next. He didn't need validation from marble floors or chandelier light. What he needed was certainty, that when the phone rang at 3 a.m., it wouldn't come with questions of how to pay. In the hours before stepping into the bank, he reviewed every clause, every footnote. He'd fought his way from city blocks ignored by cab drivers to boardrooms lined with imported oak. But even now, success meant nothing if the people he loved could still suffer because of a missed signature or a hidden fee. So he sat, unshaken, while they whispered. Because he knew what they didn't. This visit wasn't about being served coffee in fine china. It was about making sure that when his mother's heart faltered, the system wouldn't. His mind stayed on her, the first person who taught him that being underestimated can be turned into an advantage. That was the real motive, and no amount of laughter or rolled eyes at the front desk could distract him from it. Before power makes a move in daylight, it studies everything in the dark. Long before he set foot in that bank, he knew their names, knew their board of directors, the layers of silent partners behind the etched brass plaque on the door, knew the trust packages they offered to old money clients, and which law firms reviewed those documents every quarter. He knew the regional manager's bio from an industry podcast 3 years ago. The assistant manager's favorite vacation spot, buried in a blog no one read. He read their annual reports, cross-referenced the footnotes about high-net-worth client growth. At night, while others slept under the comfort of tomorrow looking the same as today, he studied obscure case files about how banks handle liability if a trustee dies. Unexpectedly, it wasn't obsession, it was the armor built by a man who had seen contracts turned against those who couldn't read the small print, so when they chuckled at his scuffed shoes or the simple black suit, they never imagined the mind quietly cross-checking every question they asked against the legal language he'd memorized. They thought they saw a customer, but what stood before them was an architect, drawing invisible lines to protect a family legacy they'd never understand. His calm wasn't weakness, it was built on data, strategy, and a memory that had rehearsed this visit 1,000 times before dawn ever broke. And as they handed him forms designed to intimidate, he noted the missing disclosures, the outdated fee clause, the handshake that was a test of how firm his resolve might be. All of it was research, silent, deliberate, unstoppable. Some inherit trust funds, others inherit stories and warnings etched in pain. He didn't grow up hearing bedtime stories about fairy kings or silver dragons. Instead, his stories came from the weary lips of a mother counting bills at the kitchen table. Tales of neighbors, turned away by loan officers who smiled only at different faces. He remembered the Sunday when his uncle tried to buy a used truck, only to be told his check needed extra verification. The sales manager had barely hidden the smirk. He remembered the funeral when an entire family wept, because a grandfather's small insurance policy had vanished under missing paperwork. No lawyer would take the case. The settlement would be pennies compared to the fight. From these he learned what wasn't written in textbooks. Paperwork wasn't paperwork, it was power. Signatures weren't just ink, they were leverage, and dignity wasn't a gift. It was a shield you forged yourself. So when the marble floor bankers assumed his silence meant ignorance, they missed the generational fire burning behind calm eyes. Every form they handed over, he read line by line, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well what small print can hide. This was more than an account, it was the shield his mother deserved. The promise that illness wouldn't strip her of the little joys still left. The bank saw a client number, he saw a vow, whispered to the woman who'd worked 2 shifts so he could have one chance. In the hush of a marble lobby, true power isn't spoken. It's measured in breath, in patience, in the slow counting of seconds. He stood there, still as stone, while the staff whispered in corners, glances bouncing between screens and smug smirks. Every second that passed, they thought he was growing. Smaller. In truth, every second he was taking their measure, weighing arrogance against ignorance, calculating just how deep their prejudice ran. The assistant manager tapped impatiently at her tablet, eyes darting to his shoes and wrist. A junior associate snickered near the teller counter, mouthing something about trying too hard. To them, every polished tile reflected his difference. To him, it reflected opportunity, a chance to see who would reveal themselves first. He noted the cameras, the blind spots, the angles that caught everything. He caught the name tags, the timestamps on the forms, the tiny disclaimers that would later appear damning when played back, and behind his measured breathing was a mind doing silent math. Costs of the trust, cost of compliance, cost of public exposure versus silent payout. They saw him hesitate. They didn't see him calculating how many zeros it would take to buy their silence, or what it would cost them when silence failed. Patience wasn't weakness, it was strategy, practiced and perfected by generations who couldn't afford to move first. In that lobby, he wasn't waiting for their approval, he was waiting for the right moment to prove how wrong they all were. Sometimes, all it takes is a single look to turn quiet disdain into open mockery, and to trigger the turning of tides. The assistant manager leaned forward, tapping the polished marble with a manicured nail. She didn't bother to hide the smirk spreading across her face, the kind reserved for a customer she was certain couldn't afford to be here. Her words were wrapped in polite venom. Sir, if you're serious about opening a trust of this size, we'll need to see immediate proof of funds. Otherwise, let's not waste everyone's time. The words struck harder than any shout. They didn't echo, they settled, heavy and humiliating, carried on the hush of expensive air conditioning. A junior banker chuckled under his breath, hand half covering his mouth. The sound was small, but it tore through the lobby like a siren. Phones slipped from purses as customers pretended not to listen but turned just enough to watch. Security guards exchanged knowing glances, shoulders relaxing as if the threat had been exposed as a bluff. But in the center of the marble floor, the man in the tailored jacket only raised an eyebrow. He didn't raise his voice, didn't protest, didn't plead. Instead, he offered a single, slow smile, not wide, not loud, just enough to say thank you. Now you've given me exactly what I needed. The smirk that broke the room wasn't hers, it was his, because it meant the line had been crossed. On camera, in daylight, in front of witnesses who didn't know they were witnesses yet. They thought they'd embarrassed him. All they'd done was hand him leverage, and leverage in the right hands is worth more than any diamond. When power chooses to speak, it doesn't shout, it simply reveals itself, and the world scrambles to adjust. The room smelled of arrogance and scented oil. The assistant manager folded her arms, waiting for an apology, or an excuse, or a defeated shuffle toward the exit. But instead, the man reached inside his jacket. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. No panic in his shoulders, no anger twitching at his jaw. Just calm, as if he had all the time in the world. He pulled out a black card, not the glossy, everyday kind, but matte, heavy, edges trimmed in platinum so fine it caught the chandelier's light in a soft halo. No logo on the front. No bank name, just a chip, and an embossed number, the type issued by invitation only, whispered about in financial circles and YouTube. Top 1% secrets videos. For a heartbeat, silence wrapped the room, and in that breathless quiet, you could hear doubts slip into the minds of everyone watching. Maybe he wasn't bluffing. Maybe they'd misjudged him. The card wasn't just proof of wealth. It was proof of a door none of them could even see, let alone walk through. He didn't wave it or brag. He placed it gently on the counter, a move so casual it felt like cruelty. Run it, he said, voice low enough to sound like gravity itself. The junior banker's fingers trembled as he picked it up. The scanner beeped. A window opened on the screen, no limit displayed, just the word, approved. A hush fell across the lobby, as real and heavy as the marble underfoot. People craned their necks, wanting to see without seeming to see. In that moment, everyone understood. They weren't watching a man ask for service. They were watching someone decide what this place would become next. True power never stays in the lobby. It climbs, calmly, to the floor where real decisions live. The hush still hovered like fog when the assistant manager finally remembered to speak, but it was too late. The shift had already happened. He didn't look at her. Instead, he checked his watch. The same understated masterpiece that probably cost more than a year's rent in half the city. A quiet ding. The elevator doors slid open at the back of the lobby, the ones marked private, executive use only. Without a word, the man picked up his card, slipped it back into his pocket, and walked toward the elevator. The staff stood frozen, part fear, part curiosity, part shame. Each step he took echoed on the marble, a sound so soft yet final that it felt like a verdict. People in the lobby exchanged glances. Who is this guy? What is really happening? But none dared to follow. The doors closed behind him. The floor indicator glowed softly 2, 3, executive level. Beyond those polished steel doors, the conversation would be different. No condescension, no raised eyebrows, just cautious respect and polite language, because upstairs, titles change everything. And on those floors, the question is never can you afford it. It's how can we keep you here? Somewhere beyond the chandelier's glare, behind glass walls and walnut tables, he'd meet faces that wouldn't laugh. They wouldn't see clothes or skin first. They'd see portfolio sheets, family trusts, offshore holdings, the true currency of belonging. And while the lobby kept guessing, he was already rewriting the chapter upstairs. Respect isn't given at the counter. It's reserved for those who sit at the real table. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime onto a hallway of deep carpets and discreet artwork. Don't reception desk here. Just frosted glass doors etched with minimalist logos. The private wealth wing. The man walked past portraits of founders and benefactors, past silent hallways that smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. Every step here was quiet, deliberate, expensive. At the end of the corridor, a boardroom, sun spilling through tall windows onto a table of glossy mahogany. 3 people stood to greet him. Their suits cost more than some cars. Their eyes didn't flicker to his hoodie or his sneakers. Instead, they caught the quiet authority in his posture, the confidence in his stride, the invisible resume that said, he belongs here. The oldest among them, salt and pepper hair, soft voice, extended a hand. Welcome, Mr. Carter, he said, pronouncing the name carefully, respectfully. We're honored you've chosen our institution for your family's trust. Just like that, the entire temperature shifted. Downstairs, he was a nuisance. Up here, he was an opportunity. The chairs were plush, the water served in crystal glasses. No questions about why he wore what he wore. No sideways glances. Only numbers now. Assets. Legacy planning. Generational impact. They spoke of tax shelters, cross-border structures, charitable foundations. They spoke softly, quickly, expertly, and as he listened, the man's face stayed calm. Not because the numbers impressed him, he already knew them by heart, but because here, finally, no one underestimated him. For once, they weren't speaking to his clothes, his skin, or his background. They were speaking to him, the man who built an empire quietly enough to walk in off the street without being recognized. And in that moment, the boardroom wasn't a punishment for the staff below. It was proof of the truth. The real gatekeepers don't stand at the door. They wait behind polished tables, ready to say yes, sir. Power is quiet, influence is silent, and sometimes, The loudest message is sent without raising your voice. The man sat, hands folded, as the wealth managers detailed options: family trust, charitable foundation, real estate diversification, offshore accounts. Each line item carried weight, each suggestion an invitation to shape a legacy bigger than one man's lifetime. He nodded, occasionally asked a question so precise it made them glance at each other, reassessing him again. A lottery winner stumbling into wealth. He spoke in return on investment percentages, knew the difference between Delaware and Cayman structures, quoted market volatility stats. One executive, the youngest at the table, leaned in. "May I ask, sir, what inspired you to open this trust today, rather than earlier?" His answer was soft. "A promise to someone who raised me to be better than what people see behind the glass walls." The man could glimpse the lobby below, the same polished marble floor where the staff had laughed, rolled their eyes, mocked him. Up here, the conversation turned to impact. Scholarship programs, healthcare initiatives. How visible do you want your philanthropy to be, Mr. Carter? "Very visible," he answered, "but not about me. About the people who never get invited into rooms like this." The air grew heavier with respect. The room sensed what was really being built. Not just a financial shield, but a statement. He leaned back, watching the golden hour sunlight catch the crystal water glasses. They offered him another coffee. This time, they remembered to ask if he preferred sugar or not. Downstairs, staff still gossiped by the teller desks. Upstairs, a trust worth more than their branch's annual deposits was being signed, and in that contrast lay the real lesson. Sometimes, behind the frosted glass, the man they underestimated quietly rewrites the script of who belongs and who decides. Ink flows silently, but its impact echoes for generations. The contract sat thick and weighty on the polished mahogany table. Pages of legal language spelling out legacies, obligations, protections, all the invisible armor built by wealth. One by one, he turned the pages. Initials here, signature there. Each flourish of his pen wasn't just compliance, it was declaration. Across from him, the senior partner of the bank shifted in his seat. Voice softer now, posture respectful. Only an hour ago, the same partner had whispered walk risk to a colleague. Now, he addressed him as Mr. Carter with every breath. Silence enveloped the room, broken only by the soft scratching of pen on paper. To an outsider, it would look mundane. To those who understood power, this was the moment everything changed. A trust to care for his mother, a secondary foundation to fund community clinics, and a clause, scholarships specifically earmarked for underrepresented youth from his old neighborhood. He didn't pause to explain why. The documents would do the talking when the final signature landed on the last page. The lead advisor gently gathered the papers as if handling something sacred. Hayes' voice had none of the casual arrogance from before. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter, your trust is now fully active." No cameras, no applause, just a room full of people realizing they'd just watched a man, once mocked, quietly set in motion millions of dollars to reshape lives. He exhaled, not in relief, but in calm satisfaction. Outside the glass, the branch looked the same. Marble floors, velvet ropes, curated flower arrangements. But for him, it would never look the same again. One quiet hour, one determined heart, one steady signature, and an entire institution left speechless. Sometimes the longest walk is only a few steps, but it changes everything. He rose from the conference table. Papers now signed, trust established, power reclaimed. The advisors stood almost on instinct, offering handshakes they wouldn't have offered an hour ago. But he didn't linger for small talk or hollow apologies. With calm, measured steps, he walked back toward the lobby. The same marble floors, the same polished brass railings, the same security cameras, catching every moment. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the junior teller, the one who'd stifled laughter when he first arrived, freeze mid-conversation. Eyes widened, posture stiffened, whispers spread like ripples in a pond. Clients who had ignored him earlier now glanced up, puzzled by the sudden hush that followed him like a shadow. He didn't glare, didn't smirk, didn't need to. The simple act of walking back through those halls, head high, documents in hand, was enough. Each step echoed louder than words. "I came to do something good. You tried to shame me for it. I did it anyway." And that, more than wealth, more than reputation, was what left the room silent. They couldn't mock what they didn't understand. Quiet power rooted in purpose. By the time he reached the elevator, even the branch manager had stepped out of her office, wearing a forced smile that looked painfully new on her face. He pressed the button, waited in silence, and as the elevator doors slid open, for a single breath, the entire floor seemed to pause. No applause, no fanfare, just the truth everyone felt but wouldn't say. They had underestimated a man whose only crime had been loving his mother enough to build her legacy. On the surface, it looked like money, but it was always deeper than that. It wasn't about the private trust. Not really. He could have set it up remotely, could have sent lawyers, signed digital documents, never stepped foot inside the building, but he chose to come in person. To walk through those glass doors wearing a plain watch, no tailored suit, no entourage to see with his own eyes. How the system would treat someone, it assumed, was powerless, because it wasn't just for his mother's security, it was a test, a quiet audit of the human heart. In those first minutes, they failed spectacularly. Laughter, suspicion, condescension, all laid bare without him saying a word. And when the truth came out that he was not just a wealthy client, but one of the institution's newest silent partners, the mood flipped faster than an opening bell. They didn't ask about his mother, or what illness had driven him here. They didn't ask what it felt like to see her health fade while planning her legacy. They only saw dollar signs, new deposits, potential promotions. But for him, it was about proof that under the marble and the velvet, the world still ran on assumptions. And maybe, just maybe, by forcing them to see it, he could crack something open. Not to destroy, but to rebuild. A mother's health failing, a son carrying her name forward, and a lesson carved into polished stone. Never assume. Kindness must wear a tailored suit. That was why he really came. Sometimes the loudest moments happen when no one dares to speak. As the private banker finished reading the documents, a silence spread through the marble hall. Thick, heavy, undeniable. Phones stopped buzzing. Laughter died mid. Even the ticking of the antique clock on the far wall seemed to hesitate. It wasn't a silence born of awe. It was the silence of realization, of shame dawning too late. For the staff, it was the sudden, crushing awareness that the man they had mocked could sign a single form and close half the portfolios they managed. That the person they'd labeled not worth their time now held their careers in his hand. For the security guard, it was the cold, sweat dripping down his collar, remembering every dismissive glance he threw Marcus's way. For the receptionist, it was the memory of that patronizing smirk, now twisting into regret. But Marcus, for him, the silence felt different, not triumph, not revenge, just emptiness, because even $50 million in fresh deposits couldn't erase the sting of being laughed at for how you look. They stared at him now, waiting for some grand statement. But the lesson had already been written in the air they breathed. All it took was a suit, a signature, and a single phone call to reveal how shallow respect can be. Respect given by force isn't real. It's the silence after, when eyes drop to the floor, that tells you who people really are. And in that quiet, marble hall, Marcus understood. Their fear was louder than any apology they could ever offer. Some trusts protect money, others test. Hearts with the hush still hanging in the air, Marcus finally broke it, not with anger, but purpose. He instructed the banker to create a special trust in his mother's name, a multi-million-dollar fund designed to support her medical care, and, upon her passing, to become a scholarship foundation for single mothers from disadvantaged backgrounds, a trust that wouldn't just sit behind cold vault doors, but move through hospitals and classrooms, changing real lives. Because Marcus had learned, painfully, that true security doesn't come from locking wealth away. It comes from sharing it where it's needed most. The staff watched, stunned, as he dictated terms that revealed the man beneath the suit, full coverage for the best treatment. Money could buy. Annual donations to women's shelters. A clause mandating that recipients of the scholarship had to mentor someone else in return. In minutes. The mocking laughter they had offered him was exchanged for silent witness to something bigger. A black man, once ridiculed, now using wealth not to crush them, but to lift others. It wasn't the act of someone driven by spite, it was the act of someone driven by something stronger. Legacy. Marcus knew money could open doors. But what good were open doors if you walked through them alone? By the time the banker hit save on the trust document, something subtle but powerful shifted in that marble hall. Fear turned to respect, mockery turned to memory, and Marcus, once invisible to them, became unforgettable. Impresses people for a moment. Purpose impresses them forever. The trust was signed, the test was passed, and the world outside had no idea what kind of story was about to unfold next. Truth whispers. Rumors roar. As Marcus stepped outside the bank's grand doors, the wind of Rodeo Drive felt different on his face. Or maybe, he felt different inside, but the marble walls behind him still hummed with whispers, now louder than any apology. Words spread fast in circles built on status. By the time he reached the curb, employees were already messaging their friends. You won't believe what just happened. He wasn't a thug, he's a CEO. He just set up a trust worth millions. And it's for his mother. Rumors once meant to ridicule, twisted themselves into reluctant awe in the language of luxury. Money. Marcus had spoken the only words they truly respected, and yet what no one understood, he wasn't doing it for them. Inside the bank, those marble walls that had seen generations of privilege now held the echo of a different story. A man they'd dismissed had flipped the narrative from embarrassment to empowerment without raising his voice. Some staff felt a sting of shame. Others scrambled to salvage professional masks. But the real shift wasn't in their posture. It was in the question that settled heavy in every mind. Who else have we misjudged? Outside, Marcus paused beside the bank's stone lion statues. To the tourists and shoppers passing by, he was just another man checking his watch. But behind that calm glance lay a decision to let the rumor mill keep churning, because sometimes, rumors can do what lectures never could. They force people to see what they refused to notice. Power doesn't always come from proving people wrong. Sometimes it comes from letting them realize it themselves. And as the sun slipped lower over Rodeo Drive, those whispers carried Marcus's story far beyond marble walls, toward people who'd never even set foot inside the bank. The mood had shifted like the hush before a thunderstorm. The same marble floors where Marcus once stood silent now felt charged with unspoken questions. Clerks shuffled papers. They no longer saw. Managers stared at screens that offered no escape from what had just unfolded. Every polished surface reflected more than chandeliers. It reflected the guilt in glances, the tremor in polite smiles, and the undeniable truth that money wasn't the real wealth Marcus had displayed. It was restraint. It was resolve. Word reached offices beyond the lobby. Risk management, compliance, executive suites perched above in frosted glass silence. They watched clips of the moment, the laughter, the hush, and the quiet signature that turned embarrassment into history. Behind the scenes, emails flew. How could this happen? Why wasn't he recognized? Damage control plan by end of day. Yet no memo could unwrite what had been written in marble and memory, because the real damage wasn't external. It was in realizing that the true liability wasn't the account Marcus opened. It was the prejudice they'd exposed. Security footage caught staff watching the door long after Marcus left, like waiting for the door itself to judge them. Because sometimes the quietest exit makes the loudest statement. Power walks silently, regret echoes forever, and in that marble hall built to intimidate, they discovered something priceless. One man's dignity can shake centuries of assumption, more than a raised voice ever could. In the hour that followed, screens lit up across offices and lounges. The grainy footage, a man in a charcoal suit, a platinum card glinting under chandeliers. Staff laughter turned to stunned silence, spread faster than any press release could catch. It appeared first on a junior clerk's private story, captioned with a single word, "Oops." Then it leaped 2 group chats, slipped onto TikTok, reposted on Instagram with hashtags like #wealth-and-silence and #bank-karma. Outside, commuters watched on phones between sips of coffee. Inside, staff watched the same clips with growing dread. Some whispered about quitting before the board demanded resignations. Others rehearsed apologies they knew would sound too late. Management tried to spin statements. Unfortunate misunderstanding. All clients are valued equally. But the footage said otherwise. It said, "You saw his skin, not his story. You saw a problem, not a person." The clip lasted under a minute, yet it proved longer than any history the bank had written about itself. A century of polished image undone by seconds of unveiled contempt, and as views climbed past hundreds of thousands, then millions, there was no off switch. The bank's marble walls had reflected more than wealth that morning. They had reflected prejudice, and now the whole world could see. Screens can't judge, but people can, and the people were watching, not just Marcus, but every silent Marcus who ever walked out unnoticed. As the bank's crisis team scrambled, Marcus sat quietly in a corner office they'd reluctantly offered just until the situation was handled. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. Instead, he opened his laptop, typed a few calm lines, and pressed send. Minutes later, executive phones buzzed. Subject line, "Immediate review, Johnson Asset Group." In an instant, the silent name spoke louder than any words. Board members' faces drained of color. They whispered it to each other, like sharing a rumor they hoped wasn't true. Johnson Asset Group. The same private firm with controlling interests in commercial real estate across the district. The same firm that had quietly purchased stakes in several private banks over the last year. And sitting in that modest chair, Marcus wasn't just a man who walked in with a card. He was the silent hand behind part of their own marble floors. A single name shifted everything. Staff, who once smirked, now avoided his gaze. Managers who questioned his worth now stumbled over apologies. Executives who laughed quietly now calculated risk. In less than an hour, the power had tilted. The client became the question the board couldn't answer, because Marcus Johnson wasn't just opening a trust for his ill mother. He could decide whether the branch even kept its doors open. It wasn't the platinum card that frightened them. It was the quiet knowledge of whose signature could appear on a deed. The truth. Sometimes the weight of a name is heavier than any vault of gold. Marcus didn't need to lecture them on prejudice. He didn't need to raise his voice or list the ways they'd failed. All he did was sit, calm, deliberate, and watch the panic spread like spilled ink across marble floors. Phones rang in hushed tones. Emails flew. Managers exchanged glances, heavy with regret. And Marcus, he sipped water, checked his watch, and waited. Outside the frosted glass, the staff who once chuckled behind desks now stood stiff, unsure where to look. They'd spent years training their eyes to spot real clients. Now, those same eyes betrayed them, unable to meet the calm stare of the man whose presence rewrote their definition of worth. Executives rushed back and forth, but Marcus never moved. No dramatic monologue, no grand statement about racism or justice. His silence was its own indictment, and in that quiet, the staff heard everything they'd ignored for years. The jokes, whispered under breath, The sideways glances, the false politeness that soured into suspicion at the first sign of difference. In that moment, the sound of shuffling papers felt louder than thunder, because nothing terrifies the privileged more than seeing power slip without a single word spoken. It wasn't the confrontation that changed them, it was the realization that Marcus had the power to destroy them, and chose, for now, to simply watch. Marcus reached into his jacket, fingers brushing over smooth leather. The staff stiffened, their eyes locked on his hand as though expecting an outburst, an accusation, something loud and messy. Instead, he calmly drew out a single, matte black credit card. Not flashy, not gold-plated, but understated. The kind of card whispered about in finance circles, known to open doors even CEOs rarely see. He set it gently on the polished table. The only sound a soft click of plastic on marble. A ripple of realization crossed the room. The branch director's face paled, his practiced smile faltering, because that card wasn't just proof of wealth, it was proof of belonging. Proof that the man they had tried to dismiss could buy and sell their illusions of exclusivity without blinking. Marcus never once mentioned the trust fund, the 7-figure deposits, or the board connections. He didn't need to. The card did all the talking. It spoke of a life built on quiet discipline. It hinted at boardrooms where Marcus's voice shaped markets, and it reminded them that the true measure of a man isn't what he wears, it's what he carries in silence. In that small black rectangle lay more power than their entire branch had ever touched, and Marcus knew they finally understood who really held it. As the card rested on the marble, the silence felt dense, like thick velvet draped over the entire lobby. No more snide whispers, no more sidelong glances. Every employee seemed to shrink an inch, realizing the shallow cruelty of their earlier smirks. Marcus didn't gloat, he didn't lecture them on respect, or spit back the poison they'd thrown his way. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He let them stew in the weight of what they'd seen. The tension in the air became a mirror, reflecting their own prejudice back at them, and what they saw there in their own eyes, not his, was enough to crack the polished confidence they wore like armor. The director cleared his throat, a soft embarrassed cough that tried to break the silence, but the hush clung stubbornly, forcing each staff member to confront the truth. They hadn't just misjudged a customer, they had humiliated a man who didn't need to shout to prove his worth. That hush did more than any speech could have done. It taught them real power doesn't come from proving someone wrong in words, but from living so fully in your truth that the room learns it by itself. As the staff tried to process what had just happened, Marcus was already on the next move. He didn't stay to watch their apologies form or excuses bubble to the surface. Instead, he turned toward the frosted glass doors marked executive conference room. Inside waited the real conversation, the one they never imagined he'd be part of. When Marcus stepped through, the polished table seemed almost to stretch endlessly, its surface dotted with leather portfolios and crystal water glasses. At the head of the table, the regional director sat rigid, flanked by 2 senior partners flown in just that morning. Marcus didn't sit at the end, nor did he stand at the side like a guest. He placed himself squarely at the center, calm and unhurried, laying out a slim folder embossed with gold lettering, Johnson Holdings Trust, Formation and Acquisition Proposal. The partners glanced at each other, surprised by the title, but Marcus didn't bother to explain what it meant. He simply opened the folder, revealing pages that could change the entire day's meeting. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about strategy, a reminder that while they were stuck at the front desk judging appearances, the real power was already seated at the boardroom table, setting terms they'd have to follow. As Marcus turned each page, the partners leaned forward. Charts, financial statements, and signed letters of intent filled the folder, evidence of the trust's size, potential acquisitions, and its charitable mission to cover his mother's medical care and fund scholarships for underprivileged youth. Their eyes widened. This wasn't a few $100,000, it wasn't even a few million. Marcus was speaking in terms of 8 figures, and possibly more, once the assets matured. In the stunned silence, Marcus explained, almost casually, that his family's holding group had recently acquired a minority stake in the very bank's parent company. A quiet move, buried in legal filings few bothered to read, which meant that not only was Marcus a prospective client, he was now, technically, one of their new shareholders. They swallowed hard. Every laugh from the lobby, every dismissive glance, every policy applied selectively, all of it had just become a liability. The power dynamic had flipped so completely, the room practically tilted with it. Marcus was no longer the man hoping for service. He was the man deciding whether they deserved his business and whether their careers could weather the storm if he withdrew it. Everyone in the room could feel it. The moment where the real power revealed itself wasn't in money alone, but in knowing exactly where to look. Marcus let the silence stretch. An old negotiation tactic his mentor had taught him. He tapped the folder gently, drawing their eyes back to the fine print. Inside, along with the trust documents, sat a single-page addendum, a proposed service equality and transparency clause. Simple language, direct intent. It required any branch, anywhere, dealing with the Johnson Family Trust to follow strict anti-discrimination protocols. All customers to be greeted within 60 seconds. No dress code-based service denials. Staff to receive quarterly bias training. Random third-party audits to ensure compliance. NAN-compliance. Automatic review by the Trusts Board, which included outside civil rights attorneys and activists, ready to take it public. For a brief moment, the air felt razor-thin. The senior partner's fingers twitched, ready to object, then hesitated. Because Marcus wasn't asking, he was offering them a chance to be on the right side of history. Before the headlines wrote themselves, it wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about every client who'd ever been quietly turned away, patronized, or priced out because of skin color or accent. It was about rewriting the unspoken rules, right there, in black and white. Sometimes power isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet pen stroke that echoes for generations. Marcus leaned forward, his hand steady, and signed his name on the last page. The scratch of the pen tip on thick embossed paper felt louder than the ticking clock on the mahogany wall. The senior partner swallowed hard, then signed to the corner of his eye twitching as the realization sank in. This wasn't just another trust, that it was precedent, document that would quietly force one of the world's most exclusive banks to police its own biases. Forever, as the ink dried, Marcus thought of his mother, a woman who once cleaned other people's offices at night, who taught him that dignity isn't something the world gives, it's something you carry until the world has no choice but to see it. The trust wasn't just about wealth, it was a shield, a lever, a statement carved into the heart of an institution that had mistaken polished stone for moral authority. Outside, the marble lobby hummed with quiet footsteps. Inside, a legacy was being forged, word by word, line by line, and none of the onlookers, not the interns, not the junior partners, not even the security guard peering in from the glass, would forget the sight of the man they'd mocked, calmly rewriting the rules they had taken for granted. A single moment doesn't end at the edge of marble floors. It flows outward, unstoppable. The signed documents didn't stay locked in the vault. Copies moved through corridors lined with portraits of men who'd never imagined someone like Marcus would sit across the table, let alone set new terms. Word spread faster than rumor. The new trust came with conditions, bias audits, blind application processes, annual diversity reporting, penalties written in plain language that even the most stubborn executive couldn't sidestep at first. Some scoffed. Token gestures, they whispered behind walnut doors. But then, the numbers shifted. More black entrepreneurs walked through those glass doors and left with approvals, not polite refusals. Community leaders took note, clients demanded more, and the bank, proud, ancient, immovable, found itself dancing to a rhythm set by the man they had laughed at only hours before. The marble pillars stayed the same, but the current running through them had changed forever. Meanwhile, Marcus never paused to take a victory lap. He understood. Real change isn't a headline, it's what happens when the door stays open for the next person, and the next, until the sight of respect given isn't surprising anymore. It's expected as the trust's unusual terms circulated. Eyes in distant skyscrapers narrowed. Legal departments ran forecasts. PR teams drafted quiet statements, just in case, and in polished suites overlooking skylines, executives faced a question they hadn't planned for. What if this wasn't a one-off? What if tomorrow another Marcus walked into another branch? What if people no longer tolerated polite exclusion, wrapped in velvet words? Some wanted to dismiss it. Old money circles thrive on habit, not reform, but the metrics spoke louder. New deposits from underrepresented clients surged. Community goodwill appeared in places where the bank had once been invisible, and the cost of clinging to the old ways rising. Lawsuits, social backlash, viral shame now had a price tag too high to ignore. Behind every marble column, minds began shifting not from kindness, but from calculation. They saw what Marcus understood from the start. Inclusion wasn't a favor. It was leverage, it was growth, and it could no longer be left to chance. The pen Marcus lifted wasn't just for paperwork. It was for history. As the final signatures dried on the trust documents, a quiet transformation took root. His mother's care was secured. Yes, but the trust terms reached far beyond family. Scholarships earmarked for first-generation students. In finance, microloans set aside for minority-owned startups, community banking programs and neighborhoods. The bank's glossy brochures had skipped. The wealth that once might have vanished into vaults now moved outward, rippling through lives Marcus would never meet. One branch's humiliation had birthed an institution-wide awakening. In the weeks that followed, the marble lobby grew familiar with new faces. Clients who once stood at the velvet rope walked in, heads high. Tellers trained to look for cues of worth instead offered quiet, genuine greetings. The security cameras still recorded, but now they captured change in slow motion. Small acts of dignity, repeated until they became the new standard. And for Marcus, the victory wasn't just about shutting a branch down or forcing apologies. It was this, knowing that somewhere down the line, a kid would walk through those polished doors and find them open without having to prove a thing. The video didn't fade as most viral clips do. It multiplied. Reborn in commentaries, reaction videos, podcasts dissecting every raised eyebrow and muttered word. Financial analysts debated Marcus's strategy. Social justice panels praised his restraint and foresight, and young viewers, watching late at night, glimpsed a lesson tucked beneath the luxury. That power isn't always loud, sometimes it's quiet, strategic, and unstoppable. Other banks noticed. Boardrooms held hushed meetings. Could it happen to us? PR departments dusted off diversity pledges and found them embarrassingly thin. Some saw only risk. Others, possibility. Because what Marcus proved wasn't just that discrimination costs money, but that reform, if done sincerely, could build something priceless. And as the footage looped online, the card, the stunned silence, the final, calm statement, it began to feel less like a moment of revenge and more like a blueprint. At first, it was just the niche business channels picking it up. Segments labeled Leadership Under Pressure and Turning Bias into Brand Reform. But soon, primetime news anchors leaned into the story. They showed the marble lobby, the hush before the storm, the way Marcus stood unmoved under the weight of laughter. Not as a victim, not even as an aggressor, but as something rarer. A strategist who turned insult into industry-wide reflection. And as the story spread, something surprising happened. Other customers, once silent, began sharing their own stories. A pattern emerged, painting a broader, darker mural of quiet humiliations behind glass counters and mahogany desks. It wasn't just about a single black man with a card anymore. It became about everyone who'd ever been told politely that they didn't belong. The internet didn't let go. And in that relentless attention, the ripples Marcus started became real waves, forcing institutions to look inward, sometimes for the first time, overnight. What began as a single branch embarrassment transformed into a nationwide talking point. Podcasts debated it, think pieces dissected it, and morning shows repackaged it with bright graphics. Black CEO flips the script on discrimination, yet beneath the headlines, the real shift was deeper. Banks in other cities quietly reviewed their surveillance footage, their customer data, their complaints folders once left to gather dust. Some issued bland statements, others braced for their own viral reckoning. Marcus didn't appear on talk shows. He didn't tweet thread after thread. Instead, he worked behind boardroom doors, drafting a blueprint not for revenge, but for reform. Because going viral fades, but changing policies, training staff, installing new oversight, that's what makes a moment matter beyond the week it trends. From viral to vital, Marcus's real legacy wasn't the millions of views, it was the thousands of quiet changes sparked in boardrooms, afraid of being next. While the internet feasted on the viral moment, behind closed doors real battles unfolded. Executive teams convened urgent meetings, hushed voices, traded blame across mahogany tables, and crisis consultants charged hourly fees that would buy homes. In one tense session, the regional director dared to call Marcus a troublemaker. Another executive, mindful of the numbers flashing across news tickers, corrected him. He might be our wake-up call. Internal memos flew faster than emails ever had before. Scripts were rewritten. Branch managers were told to review the video and truly imagine what it would feel like to stand on the wrong side of that marble counter. Marcus watched all this from a calm distance. He knew that true change doesn't happen because of fear alone. Fear starts the engine, but only understanding keeps it running. In those private rooms, as defensive pride turned to embarrassed acceptance, seeds were planted that wouldn't bloom for years. But they'd bloom all the same. Word traveled fast beyond that one marble lobby. Other branches, even rival banks across town, felt the tremor. Staff in expensive suits gathered around phones, replaying the clip, some smirking nervously, others falling silent when they realized what it really meant. Workshops appeared on calendars, biased in high-net-worth client service, inclusive excellence, empathy in transactional environments. Some employees rolled their eyes, calling them PR moves, but some, especially those who'd once felt unseen themselves, leaned in, took notes, and asked questions they'd been afraid to voice. Corporate wasn't just handing out scripts. They began investing in new hires from broader backgrounds, diversifying their leadership pipeline, and pairing rookies with mentors who taught them more than just numbers. And in quiet conversations over late-night coffee, seasoned bankers admitted what they'd never said aloud: we should have known better. Marcus never asked for apologies. He built something more lasting. Reflection. Reflection that echoed from that single branch lobby into boardrooms, training slides, and lunch breaks across the country. One viral moment had become a mirror, and more people dared to look into it than anyone expected. Weeks turned into months, and Marcus's name no longer trended daily. But behind the algorithms and fleeting hashtags, a quieter impact took root. In offices miles away, a young banker remembered that video. The next time a man in dusty work boots asked about setting up a college fund, she listened without glancing at his clothes. In another city, a manager rewrote their team's performance goals, adding customer respect and community engagement as metrics alongside raw revenue. The numbers proved what Marcus had always known: trust builds profit faster than prejudice ever could. Meanwhile, His mother's health stabilized under the trust's careful stewardship. On weekends, Marcus walked her through neighborhood parks, pushing her wheelchair over sunlit paths. He rarely spoke of what happened in the bank. It wasn't about revenge, it was about making sure she never had to worry, and others like her never had to feel small. Far from the marble counters and security cameras, Marcus built a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, quietly seeded by the same money that had once been doubted. One mother's illness had sparked a chain of empathy, hidden between spreadsheets and sealed envelopes, and all it took to start was refusing to be silent when laughter echoed in marble halls. By year's end, the private bank's quarterly report showed record gains from new high-net-worth clients who once felt unwelcome. Marcus's quiet strategy had done more than dent prejudice. It had proven inclusion wasn't a cost but a catalyst. The head bankerhood smirked. That day resigned quietly, replaced by someone known less for pedigree and more for listening. Training programs spread through the parent company, driven not by guilt but by metrics. Retention up, complaints down, brand trust rising. Marcus never gloated. Instead, he stood in the same lobby months later, no cameras, no audience, and nodded at the receptionist who treated him like any other respected client. She didn't know the man in front of her had changed the very policies she now followed, and he liked it that way. Because in the final ledger of life, Marcus believed, dignity isn't something granted by gatekeepers in tailored suits, it's something reclaimed, moment by moment, by refusing to let mockery define your worth. The story didn't end the day he shut the branch. It lived on every time someone, anywhere, chose to see a customer, not a stereotype. And that, Marcus thought as he signed the final trust document for his mother, was the only balance that ever truly mattered. The documents were signed on heavy cream-colored paper, embossed, official, final. No applause marked the moment. No viral video caught it, just a man honoring his mother's sacrifices by ensuring her comfort and care would never again depend on the approval of strangers behind a marble counter. Marcus glanced at the elegant signature at the bottom. Marcus, Deshaun Carter, trustee. It wasn't the wealth itself that mattered. It was what that wealth could now protect. For years, his mother had skipped prescriptions to stretch pensions, turned down new coats each winter, and kept a plastic pouch of unpaid hospital bills tucked in a drawer. Now each one would be quietly paid off. Not by charity but by a trust, planned, legal, and irrevocable. He stepped out of the bank's grand revolving doors into the afternoon light. No one stopped him, questioned him, or asked to see proof of funds, and for the first time, perhaps, Marcus realized, this victory wasn't loud. It wasn't viral. It was written in quiet ink, in the safety it created, and in the dignity it preserved. That, he thought, was how legacies were truly built, not by shouting in boardrooms, but by protecting the people who once protected. Before stepping off the curb, Marcus turned for one final look at the building. The gold leaf letters above the doorway still gleamed in the afternoon sun. The columns still stood grand and unmoved. Inside, no one knew or would likely ever know how close they'd come to disaster that morning. The silent security cameras had caught it all. The sighs, the suppressed chuckles, the soft mockery. Now, those tapes were archived, evidence of an old habit that almost cost them everything. Yet Marcus felt no triumph. What he felt was something closer to closure. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was a personal promise, fulfilled to ensure his mother's last years would be spent in peace, not paperwork, in warmth, not worry. He could have exposed them publicly, made them viral villains, forced apologies through clenched teeth. But sometimes, the loudest victory is the one whispered in marble halls and signed in conference rooms. Marcus adjusted the cuff of his jacket, a quiet gesture of finality, and stepped forward, leaving the grand facade behind him, and carrying only what truly mattered: the trust, the legacy, and the calm certainty of a son who kept his word. Long after Marcus disappeared into the flow of the city, his actions rippled far beyond the bank's polished floors. In the weeks that followed, the new protocols began to take shape. Front desk clerks received quiet but firm reminders. Customer service training pivoted to emphasize respect, not just protocol. Senior partners began holding weekly briefings about unconscious bias, an awkward first, then a steady routine. Marcus never once returned to the branch. He didn't need to. The change had been set in motion, like gears silently turning in a great machine. But his mother noticed the difference in him. She saw it in the way he relaxed at her bedside, in the lightness that settled on his shoulders, in the quiet joy of a son who had secured something priceless, the assurance that she would be cared for, that her life's dignity was recognized, not just by him, but by the world around her. Though the trust documents lay sealed in a vault, what mattered most wasn't on paper, it was the invisible legacy, a lesson that real power isn't loud, that real wealth isn't in numbers, but in the moments we refuse to stay silent, and that sometimes, the strongest answer to humiliation is the calm hand that fixes what was broken and then walks away. In the marble halls of that private bank, the story of the man in the tailored coat became an unspoken parable. Junior tellers whispered it to each other on slow afternoons. Executives recounted it behind polished conference tables, lowering their voices as if the walls themselves might judge them. Even new hires learned quickly, never underestimate who stands before you. Respect costs nothing, but ignorance can cost everything. The trust officers who had once smirked began to catch themselves before speaking. Security staff, once complacent, paid closer attention not just to posture or attire, but to presence, to humanity. And somewhere deep in the bank's risk management office, a report was drafted, cold and factual. Event review, June 18th. Reputational damage risk mitigated through policy overhaul. But numbers alone couldn't capture what really changed. In the hushed lobby, where sunlight filtered through etched glass, the atmosphere felt subtly different, not softer, but fairer, less brittle, more real. Because when one man dared to walk in with quiet resolve and refused to bow to humiliation, he left behind more than a trust fund. He planted an idea that every marble counter and mahogany desk is worthless if dignity isn't built into the foundation. By the time the sun dipped low behind glass towers, the bank's marble floor had stopped, echoing footsteps. The man in the tailored charcoal suit stood quietly, breathing in the stillness. What had begun as laughter behind counters had ended in a hush so deep you could hear hearts pounding. They didn't realize that wealth wasn't just in cards or wire transfers, it was in calm power, in the strength to stand still while the world spins around you. Cameras had caught every glance, every sneer, every frozen expression when that black card cut through disbelief, like a blade through silk. And when the man signed the papers and secured a future for the mother who once sold bracelets to buy his first suit, the message rang louder than any words ever could. Respect isn't requested, it's commanded by presence, by history, by quiet force. Outside, the man stepped into the night, leaving behind a vault heavier with shame than gold. He didn't look back at the branch windows, still misted by shock and regret. His mother, miles away, wouldn't care about numbers on a screen or gemstones behind bulletproof glass. She'd care that her son built something enduring, a trust that outlives prejudice, a legacy untouched by Snickers and silk ties. The cameras might replay the humiliation, but the real victory would echo in classrooms funded by scholarships, in hospital wards funded by quiet donations, in young dreamers who saw his face and believed they could walk in, too. What they saw as revenge was never revenge. It was strategy, a reminder that true wealth is using power to open doors others tried to close. So now, the question falls to us. When you step into places where eyes measure your worth by your skin, your clothes, your accent, do you shrink back, or do you hold your ground? Not just for yourself, but for those who come after you. If you were that man, would you have shouted your title at the door, or done what he did? Say nothing, and let silence speak the loudest truth. Share your thoughts below. Subscribe if you believe dignity should never have a price tag, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all.